And I do not believe in the sort of quote unquote micro interval, phenomenon. Short intervals feel easier because they are easier. And if you look at VO2, while people do intervals, VO2 can remain quite low if you keep the intervals too short.
That Triathlon Show 173. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Dr. Philip Skiba. Dr. Skiba is one of the most knowledgeable and sought-after persons in the entire endurance sports industry, as evidenced by the fact that he was an integral part of the team that was tasked by Nike to prepare Eliud Kipchoge and the other runners that were involved in the Breaking 2 project for what on the surface seemed like a superhuman feat. And in addition to that, he has, as we'll get into, been hired by the British Triathlon Federation to prepare the Brits for the London Olympics in 2012. He might be a name that many of you may not have heard of if you're not following triathlon coaching and research very, very closely, because he's perhaps not somebody who is the most out there and active on social media and that sort of thing. But trust me when I say that he is one of the superstars behind the scenes. And to me, as somebody who does follow the industry very, very closely, he's absolutely one of the biggest names and dream guests that I've ever had on the podcast. So this is a big hit, I would like to call it. Just a quick note that at the end of the interview, or a bit before the end of the interview, actually, Dr. Skiba has to run away to a patient situation, so our interview ends rather abruptly there. There are a few things that I would still have liked to discuss, and of course we missed the important rapid-fire questions, but I hope that this means that we might have a follow-up interview with him in the future. We'll get right into the interview right after we thank our sponsors. First, we have Precision Hydration that create electrolyte products to help you get hydrated and stay hydrated. And they take into account your individual sweat losses and sweat sodium content to do so. The best way of getting started is to just take a simple online quiz that consists of 10 questions or so that you can answer very easily without doing any sort of formal testing or quantifying. And that will give you a very good ballpark estimate for how much sodium you lose in your racing and training. And then Precision Hydration will give you a report with recommendations for what sort of electrolyte intake you should aim for, depending on your target race and so on. You can find that quiz on precisionhydration.com, and it's linked to in the episode description as well. And if you want to try your first box of Precision Hydration electrolyte for free, use the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps. And also note that Precision Hydration is now available in Australia and New Zealand as well. Also, big thanks to Roka, which is the world's leading brand for wetsuits, triathlon apparel, and performance eyewear. You can find them on roka.com and get 20% off your entire order with the new and changed promo code TTS. Note the old one, which I won't name here, has expired. So we have a new one, which is simply TTS, all caps. And that stands for That Triathlon Show, if you wonder, and if it makes it easier for you to remember the letter combination there. As you hear this episode towards the end of March, race season is definitely drawing near, depending on where you are in the world. And personally, being in sunny Portugal, I'm 6 days away from my first triathlon of the season by the time that you hear this episode. And it will also be my first open water swim, because here in Lisbon, it's still a bit cold for getting into the open water, I think. I actually haven't tried. It would probably maybe even be possible for a short dip, but not so much training yet. We're going down to the south coast, to the Algarve, and that's where the weather will be good enough for, or the water will be warm enough, I should say, for triathlon racing. But I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm especially looking forward to putting on my Maverick X wetsuit, because when I do, I go from okay in the water to quite good, and that's something that I always enjoy, and especially so when I not just put on any wetsuit, but actually the Roka Maverick X, because it's a fantastic wetsuit. So the swim is actually that much more fun these days than it used to be once upon a time. And whether you go for the Maverick X or one of Roka's more entry-level suits, you can be assured that the materials are all of super high premium quality. All the most important details are handcrafted, and all is in the name of Roka's mission of bringing the highest performing wetsuits and apparel in general to the world and to the triathlon market. Again, you can get 20% off your entire order, whether it's wetsuits, performance eyewear, tri-suits, swim skins, buoyancy shorts, on Roka.com using the new promo code TTS. So without any further ado, let's get into the interview with Dr. Philip Skiba. Today's guest on That Triathlon Show is Philip Skiba. Welcome to the podcast, Phil.
No, thanks for having me.
It's a great pleasure to have you. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background?
I started out in college primarily interested in cell and molecular biology. And in fact, after college, I did a master's degree in that. But after some health issues of my own, I decided to go to medical school. And while in medical school, I got very interested in exercise physiology. And so primarily because I was a terrible athlete. And so I figured there were ways to better train myself. And so I started learning more about physiology and sort of finding ways that it might be able to help me. And in fact, it helped me quite a bit. It just turned out that I continued to be very slow in comparison to everybody else. But as it turned out, the kind of things that I was working on turned out to be very helpful to athletes who were good. And so it just sort of snowballed after that. I began training some professional triathletes who started doing very well, started doing things like winning world championships. And after that, I had the opportunity to actually develop some of the training systems used by British Triathlon in the way to the 2012 Olympics, where they did very well. And after that, it just became one thing after another. I got hired to work on the Nike Breaking 2 project, and so really up to the present, that was my primary focus, was doing work for Nike.
Yeah. What a great cliffhanger there. You started working with professional triathletes suddenly from just trying to make yourself a bit less slow. What were some of the things that you were working on that seemed to be working well for you and for other athletes?
Well, there are a number of mathematical models out there that allow you to not only predict how athletes might perform, but understand how training stress comes and goes, and how, in fact, they respond to it. And so in working with those kind of tools, I was able to see that there's a lot of athletes who were succeeding in spite of their training and not because of their training. A lot of athletes, for example, doing far too much training. For example, one of the earliest examples was Joanna Zeiger, who had been an Olympian. So clearly she knew something about training herself. And yet when I analyzed her, I realized that there was far too much volume, not nearly enough intensity, and that those things needed to be switched around. Now, from my point of view, this sounded a little crazy. Here is a person who made it to the Olympics doing things the way she did. But that being said, after that analysis, and Joanna was very open to this kind of thinking because she's a scientist. She has a PhD in genetics, so she understood the thought process. And so once we applied this thought process and said, okay, we need to change your training significantly. That season she went on to win almost every race she entered, and then indeed win the world championships at the half Ironman distance and set a world record in the process. So that really kind of signaled to a lot of other people who didn't necessarily know my name, that these kind of methods, there really might be some benefit to them.
Yeah. And is that the same sort of thing that you kept working on for British Triathlon leading up to London, the London Olympics, and or something else?
Yes, exactly. Basically, I wrote some of these methods into a software package. We did some very custom work, and yeah, it worked. It really works remarkably well. And in fact,
was it an internal software package, or is that something that is available somehow?
So some of it was available to the public. For a while, I actually sold the program. It was called Race Day Apollo, And so, but after a while, it just became too much to try to, train athletes and manage a publicly available software package and all that kind of thing. I was tech support,
Yeah.
which is just a bit too stressful. So eventually, I just said, for the organizations and the Victorian Institute of Sport was using some of it. British Triathlon had their own custom setup, and so I just decided to start supporting those organizations and just not to continue doing it publicly.
Yeah. No, I can imagine that for you personally, that makes a ton of sense. So if we go back a little bit and take a big picture view at the physiology, what are the physiological variables that we are trying to improve with training?
Well, you've got three main variables, right? You've got VO2 max, which is the thing everyone typically thinks of. You've got quote unquote threshold, which I'm just going to refer to as critical power, and then you've got economy. In other words, how much oxygen does it cost you to do what you're trying to do, and these sort of this combination of factors turns out to be quite important, because your VO2 max kind of sets the ceiling, right? What's your absolute physiological capacity in terms of aerobic exercise, whereas critical power, and to a lesser state, to some extent, lactate threshold, determine how close you can approach that final limit, and how and how long you can maintain something close to that limit. And economy there also plays an important part there. And if you look at Mike Joyner's 1991 paper, I mean, you can very nicely just calculate how someone will do at the marathon distance if you know their lactate threshold, their economy, and their VO2, and their
can we say something about the relative importance, both just purely from a performance standpoint, but also from, I guess, a predictive accuracy perspective in terms of predicting performance, if we have just one or two of them?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is basically yes. All are important. One of the things we learned in terms of doing Breaking 2, that we needed a certain combination of factors to make someone physiologically capable of running the 2-hour marathon. But you can trade. If someone has slightly better economy, you can accept a slightly lower VO2 max, for example. And so, because nobody's going to be perfect. No one's going to have exactly what it is that that you're looking for. Nor is it necessarily possible to train any one of those things. Like when you train, you're necessarily working on all of those things at the same time. If you make somebody run enough, their economy improves. If you make somebody run fast, their VO2 max improves, and so on. So I think it's mistake to focus too much on any one thing. All of these factors are important, and a good training program is going to include things that improve all of these things.
And what might some of those things be?
For example, running hard intervals, for example. So somewhere above the critical speed or the critical power. Let's just say, for example, 2-minute intervals on a couple of minutes rest, repeated several times over. That's sort of a classic workout that works on VO2 max. But if you have athletes do this, for some time, you'll find that their critical power also rises, and you'll find that their economy improves somewhat. And so, although we try to target things somewhat specifically, so we do interval workouts to work on VO2 max. We may work on longer intervals, 10 to 20 minute intervals when we're thinking about working on the critical power, et cetera. But all of these things necessarily improve each other. And so really the question is, what kind of event are you trying to do? And that really is the thing that should guide what the training program looks like, not necessarily to say, I'm focusing just on one physiological system.
So if we talk about triathlon and we talk about, for example, the Tokyo Olympics, where we'll have the mixed team relay, and let's say that we have theoretically somebody who is trying to get into a national team for the mixed team relay, so very short and fast triathlon, versus somebody focusing on Ironman. How does that impact their training program then, and what they would focus on?
I mean, necessarily there's going to be a difference in volume between those programs. going Ironman, somebody once said that Ironman is the last refuge of the slow. and so when you're working on something like Ironman, for example, really you're thinking about much longer rides, 100-mile rides, and doing periods of those rides, near the race pace you hope to maintain, or slightly faster than that, for example. When you're dealing with something shorter, you just don't need that much volume. What's more important, volume is certainly important, and that provides the fatigue resistance that the muscles require. But it's really important to be looking at doing quite a bit of training at or near race speed. And there are tactical considerations as well. When you're pack riding and things like that are less important in Ironman. When you're dealing with something like Olympic distance triathlon, it's just it's a very different skill set, which again is something that the training program needs to focus on. Right, the most important organ to performance is the brain, and so you need to stay on top of that, and then on top of tactics and understanding how to handle that kind of thing.
It's interesting. We had just last week we had Joel Filial on as a guest, who I'm sure you know from your time at British Triathlon.
Yeah,
and he talked quite a bit about with their squad. They do a significant volume for sprint and Olympic distance racing, but he also talked about doing not that much really training at race pace, or especially not above race pace. So a very limited amount of that. So how would you, and that sounds a bit counterintuitive or a bit contradictory to what you were saying for this mixed team relay athlete, for example, and how they should be training. How would you, what's your take on that, and how they train, from just a brief description?
Well, I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying before, right? That there's a lot of different ways, to skin a cat. And so, looking at, doing a lot of high volume training, provided that you have athletes that respond to that type of training, you might have a fair amount of success there. But to me, it seems, I would have a hard time just having someone riding a lot of volume and then throwing them into a race where they need to spend a lot of time at or near their critical power, for example. And more importantly, when you're doing a lot of surges above that speed, right, you need to make breaks, you need to cover attacks and things like that. I think you're in dangerous territory if you purely want to focus on putting a lot of miles in the legs.
Okay. And so in addition to VO2 max, the critical power or threshold, and the economy, is there anything else in terms of the physiological background that triathletes, age group triathletes that perhaps want to self-coach, that they really need to know and understand to be able to plan their training and understand their training?
I think an important thing to remember is that, for example, running form, quote unquote, is not the same as economy. Athletes often try to find some kind of coach that's going to help them with their form because they think it's going to make them more economical. And when in fact, we know a couple of things. That number one, in general, the body self-optimizes. And in fact, one of my colleagues, Isabel Moore, who still teaches in Great Britain, her PhD work showed very clearly that if you take people who are complete novice runners, for example, and just make them run for 6 weeks, you find that their economy improves. And so without any coaching about their form, there's many millions of years of evolution involved in the human body, and the body has developed self-optimization mechanisms. And in fact, when you use things like motion analysis software, things like Vicon and things like that, or even older stuff that was done in the 1980s using just stop action photography, what you find is that the determinants of someone's running economy in the mechanical sense are, number one, very difficult to identify. And number two, even once you identify them, the question is, how are you going to get them to change them? A difference of just a degree or two in the tibia, the bone in the lower leg when the foot strikes the ground, is important, for example. And I just don't believe a lot of those things are truly visible by eye. And I think a lot of triathletes, or just athletes in general, runners, are on a fool's errand when looking at form and thinking they're going to do something that's going to make them a more economical runner, that someone's going to give them advice in this regard. The most important thing is probably to run a lot.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's some things like what do you think about things like plyometrics and strength training for improving economy?
Oh yeah, there's very good evidence that plyometrics and explosive strength training can improve exercise economy. And so really it depends upon who you're dealing with. When you're dealing with a relatively new triathlete, for example, someone who's sort of a middle of the packer, you can have them do some very basic plyometrics, box jumps, hurdle hops, things like that. And a great book in this regard is Bosch and Klomp's running exercise physiology in practice, because it very nicely summarizes a lot of this type of exercise, and it goes from the very easy to things that are more difficult. And so when you're dealing with a novice athlete, just the simple hopping drills and things like that may be beneficial. Bosch and Klomp talk about some very advanced things that you shouldn't be doing without a very good strength coach with you. But these things are certainly important. At the very beginning, it's just important to get them running, for example. But as athletes improve, all the professional athletes I deal with, all of them are on a good plyometrics program.
Yeah.
The question, then becomes, as they become truly advanced, are we really getting anything more out of that? And I genuinely don't know the answer to that question.
Right. Do you work with athletes these days that are, is it across the board, is it mostly triathletes and across the distances, or even runners? Since the Breaking 2 project has stopped, have you continued doing work in running, and what's the makeup of the athletes that you work with, I guess?
Yeah, I'm unfortunately not able to talk too much about who and what I work with at the moment, just due to some agreements that I'm involved in. But I have a lot of different athletes that I deal with at this point. It's everybody from triathletes to elite level runners, to people in other sports, other professional sports, because, and I think this is the important thing, is that the science is the same irrespective of the sport. If you understand the physiology, the way to at least address physiology and address some of those determinants of performance is self-evident. And so I've been very fortunate in that, that forward-thinking people in many different sports have come to me and said, it seems that you know something about this. How can we maybe do this better? How can we change these little things? And I think this is the intersection of science and practice, right? No one has the whole picture. Most good coaches are 90% of the way there, but there are a few things that I can offer that get you a few percentage points of performance that may be a determinant of whether you win or not win, for example. And so I think that's really what somebody like me offers, is sort of a 30,000 foot view of hey, there's some things that just traditionally you may do in this sport that seems important, but it turns out that actually maybe this is not as important as you might think, or maybe what you're doing here is it may actually be detrimental. And so why don't we tweak this a little bit? Why don't we change this a little bit in terms of your training, and see how the athletes do? And this is the thing, right? It's about two things. It's about the coach and the athlete and myself being willing to be accountable. You measure performance consistently, and either the athlete is better or they are not better. And if they are not better, you need to change something. And early in my career, this is one of the things I found to be most frustrating, is that coaches did not like being accountable, because they liked the ability to be able to blame it on the athlete. Oh, they didn't do this or they didn't do that. But when you're strictly measuring training and you're strictly measuring performance, you can then look. And if the athlete is executing what you're telling them to do and they are not improving, that's your fault. It's not the athlete's fault.
Do you have an example of a situation when somebody has plateaued, for example, with their coach, and you have come in and found something that you have helped them tweak in their program, and then suddenly the athlete has been able to break through that plateau?
Yeah, I'm obviously not going to name names, no. But I've definitely come into situations. The volume versus intensity debate is always a good one. I think one of the big dangers in sport is that when you deal with a coach that was formerly an elite athlete, they end up thinking that what worked for them is going to work for anybody, and that's just simply not the case. And so what I have found very often is that athletes and coaches are working together. Athletes are asked to bend it to the coach's program rather than the coach saying what is going to work for this particular athlete. And like I said, Joanna was a great example of that. And I often talk about her because, we were very public about the things that we changed with respect to her training. But we were able to go back in there and say, yeah, there's really no intensity here at all. It's really just miles and miles and miles. I believe it was Einstein who said, one definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the first thing I do with any athlete or any coach that brings me in on a consulting basis is I look at the training, not just in terms of weeks and months. I look at over a period of years or an Olympic quadrennial and say, what have you been doing and what has been the change in performance? And when you have someone who's plateaued, when you're training them the same way and you're getting the same result over and over again, that's a situation that's ripe for intervention. You say, hey, let's just take one of these workouts and change it significantly. Let's give them a stimulus they have not seen before, and see what the result is. Continue to measure performance. Are they getting better or not?
So on that, the volume versus intensity debate is obviously a super important one and very interesting. Do you see that the more common thing there on the elite athlete side at least would be that they do that you would like them to do more intensity and less volume, or is it really falling on both sides of the spectrum? Or how?
It's interesting because there do seem to be volume responders and intensity responders. And almost everybody requires some element of both. So it's not necessarily that I may reduce the total training hours spent. But what I might do is say, we're going to take this hour that used to be this and turn it into something else. And see what kind of response there is. Because no matter what you're doing, volume is important. Volume is one of the main drivers of fatigue resistance, which is critically important in almost everything. Any really endurance enterprise. And so, even when you look at track cyclists, they ride, thousands and thousands of miles, even though their event is only, a few minutes long, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. And pool swimmers is a great example.
Swimmers are a fantastic example. Although swimmers are one of the places where, it often can be a little bit beneficial to cut volume just a little bit. We see, there was I think it was Costel's data back in the 70s that showed that once you get above about 25 or 30,000 yards, that you're just not seeing improvements in performance anymore. And so, yet, I have high school students that come into my medical practice who are injured or overtrained in things, that they're swimming 5,000 yards or more a day on a regular basis. And so these are things where a scientist can intervene and say, hey, I know you think all this yardage is necessary. It may not be. A lot of yardage is important, but you can't do it to excess.
When it comes to volume, how important do you think frequency there is, or how do you look at frequency versus like those really long days? Traditionally, for example, cyclists are known to mostly have been training once per day, but do really long workouts, like having plenty of those 6-hour days. Whereas, of course, triathletes by necessity have a lot of frequency in their training because we have free sports. But runners, for example, might split their volume over two runs or sometimes even 3 runs per day. So how do you look at frequency's role in that volume piece of the pie?
Yeah, it's very difficult to say. Frequency is good in terms of reducing injury risk. In other words, rather than stacking everything into one workout, to cut it up into a couple of workouts. So I think there is some benefit to that. And there's probably some amount of benefit to training in a slightly glycogen depleted state. Those are all those are some of the benefits we think may occur with frequency. As a physician, I'm always looking through things in that way as well. And so as I've often said, practice does not make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And so it's particularly when you're dealing with a runner, when they start to fatigue and that they're not holding their form anymore. Those are situations when it can be important to say, hey, let's reduce the one session volume. Let's break it up into a couple sessions, at least initially, to be sure that you're able to maintain form. You're not running the risk of getting yourself hurt or doing something silly. So I think, but if I'm looking at a large scale program, there's typically an interplay between the two. So early on, I'll be working less on volume and more on frequency. So I might say, sure, we're going to do 4 shorter runs rather than 3 longer runs. And then we may start to build up the length of those runs, and then we may come back to 3 runs for a short period of time. And as we build up the length of those, then we might say, okay, now we're going to go back to 4 or even 5. So I'm always trying to play one against the other. I'm training some volume for frequency, or some intensity for both, so some intensity for volume, and trying to keep some element of balance. Because again, all of these things are important. When you think about periodization, the athlete should always be doing everything. They should always be doing some intensity. They should always be doing some volume. They should always be doing a little bit of threshold work. And the balance between them depends on where in the training cycle they are. You should be going from a sort of general training to specific training as you get closer to the goal event. And that's how I balance things. At no point are my athletes doing no intensity and just working on volume. They always have a track workout, and even during their long runs, they often have some element of quality work.
Yeah. That seems to be the dominating view these days. I think that traditional periodization is really falling out of favor with most coaches and researchers as well. So in terms of the intensity that you do, then if we go a little bit deeper into that, and let's talk specifically for triathlon. You mentioned there how distribution changes to be more specific the closer you get to the race. But how do you distribute, for example, between the different disciplines? How much intensity do you typically like to see in a program? Just elaborate on your thoughts on that very big topic of intensity.
Yeah, for the average triathlete, every week they've got some kind of an interval workout. And I do not believe in the sort of quote unquote micro interval, phenomenon. Short intervals feel easier because they are easier. And if you look at VO2 while people do intervals, VO2 can remain quite low if you keep the intervals too short. So usually, for example, in someone in their running program, they may spend some time running some 200s or something like that. But in general, their long intervals are 400 or 800. To make sure, because you're looking for something that's going to be, get you above a minute and a half, 2 minutes, and so on to really drive VO2. And so every week my athletes have an interval workout of some kind, even if it's only a few. If we're doing a volume period, their interval workout may just be 4x400 or something like that. During another run 1 day a week. And they also have at least some element of threshold work. So every week they've got a workout where they're, doing intervals that are at least 5 minutes in length. If we're during a period of time when it's, that's not really a focus, versus, if we're getting close to a race period in an Olympic distance triathlete, there will definitely be a period where they're doing several, 10-minute intervals, very close to critical power or critical speed, for example.
And how many workouts would you have in a triathlete program? Would it be how many on the swim and how many on the bike and the run? Would it be like 2-2-2? So the shorter and the threshold in each discipline. And is there any situation where you would have more than that or less than that?
It depends. There are people, like I said, who are sort of more volume or more intensity responders. And if I figure that out early on, I'll kind of skew the athlete in that way. Some athletes are just sort of diesel; they're just good, and those are the people that tend to be good at longer events. That they can just kind of go for quite a long time at a relatively lower intensity. And if you feed them too much intensity, they get wiped out very easily. And so that's the rub, is figuring out what's going to work for that athlete. But in the general case with the average athlete, particularly if you're talking about age groupers, they're getting one sort of interval workout, one sort of threshold workout each sport every week.
And would that be like, let's say, because we have a lot of age groupers that are also very, very limited on time, and they might only train 2 workouts per week in each discipline. Would that still be the case? Would you still incorporate some intensity in all of those workouts, or would you always have some work, make sure that depending on how much the athlete trained, that some workouts are just easy, or how do you view that sort of intensity distribution?
When you're dealing with a person who's time limited, I typically then become more polarized in approach. So, for that person, I'll probably give them their longer ride, and within that longer ride, they're going to do some sort of tempo, what I call tempo paced intervals. So I might send them out for, a 3-hour ride on the weekend. But in that ride, they're going to do 3 or 4 by 10 or 20 minutes, maybe 10% below their critical power, for example. So we can get some intensity in there, but it's not at the expense of the long workout. And then on another day, I'll give them a harder workout. I'll give them a track workout. But again, they'll do a reasonable amount of running before they stop at the track and do their intervals, and then a decent amount of running, afterwards. So, a workout doesn't necessarily need to be strictly just one thing. You can add quality into something that's a little bit of a longer workout and get significant benefits that way, particularly for somebody who's time limited.
Yeah. And what about as volume increases, then do you need to take that? How do you take that into account in terms of intensity? Then would you, I guess, somehow need to cut down on intensity at a certain point if you have, like, let's say you have a more of an elite athlete or a good age grouper that trains a lot and their intense workouts are pretty hard, pretty chunky workouts, let's say 4 times 10 minutes at threshold and 10 times 2 minutes for that short track interval workout. Would you see a need ever to then reduce that intensity a bit to maybe do less of those intervals or that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is always, and this is something people often miss, is that you need to every day be checking in with the athlete and simply to see how they're feeling. One of the benefits of really tracking training stress over time is that you can compare the objective training stress with the subjective feeling of the athlete, and where those two things diverge is where it's time for you to intervene as the coach. So, for example, the first thing that goes wrong is the athlete goes to the track. They're still able to hit their paces, but it feels a lot harder than it usually did. That's a sign that it's time to reel it in. If they get past that point, then you get to the point of performance incompetence. In other words, they feel terrible and they can't hit their paces anymore. And then you know that you're not in a great position. The advice I typically give, particularly to my sort of age group athletes or more amateur or high level amateur athletes, is that you should finish each of these workouts feeling you had a little bit more left in you. At the end of your long ride, you should be able to say, I could have ridden another 5 or 10 miles if I really had to. At the end of your interval workout, you should be able to say that, yeah, I ran 6 by 400. I could have run 8 if I really had to, but I didn't. And that's the thing, is that, and one of the things about data analysis is, when you can look at their splits and things, and when you see steadily declining splits, right, that, or worsening splits, that's a sign that this workout is not going like it ought to go. Power analysis always makes this very easy because I can look at their power during a 10-minute interval. And if I see that power dropping throughout the interval, I know that this, number one, either they're too fatigued, or number two, we need to lower the power. This is just too much for them at this point. And that's really what these analytical tools are good for, is figuring out what's the athlete really capable of, not what they tell you they're capable of. When you can look right after the fact and see, did they execute or not, and then intervene in order to try and solve that problem.
Yeah. So what about rest and planning that in advance before it gets to the stage when the athlete gets overly fatigued? Do you use, for example, regular rest days that are completely off, or do you use more sort of a just very easy day approach? And what about programming in weeks that are significantly easier in the program? How do you think about these things?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 ways to do it. If I have an athlete, and this is a lot of athletes, who I don't feel are going to be completely honest with me about their level of fatigue, I'll program rest days and rest weeks very strictly to be sure that they're getting some recovery, because you don't get better from training, you get better in the recovery from training. It's an absolute requirement. And so yeah, very often I'm scheduling rest days, and maybe not an entire rest week, but an easier week for sure. On a semi-regular basis. So using mathematical modeling and stuff, you can see when someone will plateau at their current level, the training level that you're applying. And then when they get pretty close to that level, I can say, yeah, we're going to take a few easier days now before we begin the next more difficult build. When you're dealing with someone really at the elite level, who you're dealing with on an everyday basis, you can then be a little bit more holistic about how you plan it. So a training block may end up, a microcycle might be 5 days or maybe 10 days. And I'm looking at their data and I'm seeing how they're responding, and I can say, yeah, okay, you know what? Like, it looks like you're getting a little beat up here. We're going to take two easier days, and maybe that's not an absolute rest day. Maybe it's, yeah, you're going to jog 20 minutes, and go have something for lunch, just to make them feel like they did a little something. Part of the art of coaching is what I like to call the Jedi mind trick. Sometimes athletes get upset if they're resting. So you have to make them think that they're resting, or make them think that they're not resting, when actually what they're really doing is something so easy that it's not really providing any stress at all. But in the general case, I view rest as rest. You're not doing anything.
Yeah. I really like that Jedi mind trick term. It's really great, and yeah, I think that makes sense. But also, like, I think that athletes, a lot of athletes listening to this should take point and be honest with your coaches, because that makes it a lot easier for the coach to really take into account your situation, rather than having to play mind tricks with the athletes, and also perhaps trying to preemptively schedule rest that might not always be needed if the athlete is just honest.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, coaching is 99% communication. Knowing the physiology is great. Understanding how to write a great workout is fine. But the fact is, most athletes get better with especially at the amateur level, with almost any training you throw at them. The main thing is being sure that you're talking to the person and finding out when they're not feeling good, when they're feeling sore, when things might not be going exactly right. Because if you stop it then and you solve the problem then, you can prevent an injury that's going to put them out of commission for weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of tracking improvements, you mentioned there the accountability earlier, and seeing if performance improves. What methods for doing that do you prefer or recommend?
I mean, in the case of triathlon, short sort of time trial efforts, can be beneficial on a semi-regular basis. But there's lots of ways of doing it. You can ask someone to do something at the same perceived exertion and see if they're getting faster, for example. I mean, one of the favorite things we did with elite marathon runners is a lot of times they'll do a progressive run. So their long run will start out very, very easy. Maybe, for like a Kenyan, maybe even 8 minute or 8 minute 30 pace per mile, something extremely easy. By the end of the run, by perceived exertion, they're accelerating to what's sort of marathon race pace. And you look at that progression, and you look at what pace do they end up at, for example. And so that can be a performance measure in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is something that I come back to time and time again when these sort of examples come up. But that starting out at 8 minutes or 8 minutes 30 per mile, 5 minutes 5:45 per kilometer for these elite marathon runners that are trying to break 2 hours for the marathon, that I think goes a long way of telling us age group athletes that how important it is to not be afraid to go slow when we are not trying to go hard, and that will leave much more in the tank to go hard when it actually matters.
Yeah, no, I think that's the thing that I learned the most in dealing with the guys during Breaking 2 was really understanding that interplay between what's easy, and what's hard, and really obeying, and really listening to their subjective feeling that, wow, this really feels harder than it's supposed to. I need an easy day today. And I think that was just a really great thing to see, that these guys who are literally the fastest people alive were so willing to say, yeah, you know what, like I need to back off today. And I think that's a mindset that's unfortunately very rare in elite sport. Everyone thinks, and I think part of it too. I think social media has been a real curse. Is that everyone is talking about constantly. Even in the early days of some of the bulletin boards, you look at some place like, well, I won't name names, but there are popular internet discussion forums where people are always talking about their training, and I see what people say. But the thing is, I'm the guy who actually gets to see some of these people's training logs, and I know they're lying about what they're doing. So, sure, you trained for 2 hours today if you include the time it took you to drive back and forth, to the pool and how long it took you to make your smoothie, and the nap you took, then it's 2 hours, but guess what?
Yeah, perfect. What about nutrition in day-to-day life and also in training? What's fueling for training, I guess? What's your view on that, and especially for triathletes?
I mean, in general, the problem I see is not people eating too much, but people eating too little, and not necessarily eating the right things. For better or worse, over the last 10 years, there's been a big interest in low carb and ketogenic diets and all these sorts of things, which just are not appropriate for high performance. And if you read people like Louise Burke, for example, I mean, really the heavy hitters in nutrition, it's very clear is that that these kinds of diets do not improve endurance performance. That you need to be on a diet with a relatively high carbohydrate content. That doesn't mean you can eat whatever you want. Athletes need to eat to hunger, and they should come to a stable weight. I think particularly in endurance sports, we do have a problem with energy deficits and what used to be called female and male athlete triad. And so really it's crucial to fuel appropriately, because it's not about being as light as you can possibly be. It's about coming to a reasonable weight where you're going to perform at your best.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier training in a lower glycogen state, and actually recently I saw a new paper, I think, which found that if you train twice per day, which again for many triathletes is reality, then you're almost by default going to be in a low glycogen state in quite a lot of your workouts. But do you also incorporate things like any fasted training from time to time, or any other protocols for training to use that, I guess, to your advantage?
For the average triathlete, it's probably not worth the trouble. For them, it's probably most important to just be training. And when you're getting up to a higher level, then maybe it can be important to try to manipulate some of those dietary things. In particular, like when you look at the Kenyans, for example, like they're going out for their long run before they've had any real breakfast, for example. And so they are training in a slightly lower glycogen state, but it's very difficult to know the absolute performance benefits of these kind of things. I always err on the side of making sure people are well fed.
Yeah.
Because you're just not going to train well if you don't have enough calories on board.
Yeah.
I think the extent to which we really need to be manipulating diet in the average athlete, I think I'm very suspicious of that.
Okay, so it sounds like that there might be potentially a 1%er there that maybe is there, but we don't really know yet. But on the other hand, you might also fall across the fall from the edge, so to say, if you're not careful. So it's not the benefit risk trade-off might not be worth it.
Yes, exactly. I think for the average athlete, if you're at a healthy weight and you have the energy to complete your workouts, you're doing it right.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be about trying to shave off every single calorie. I'd rather have you 5 pounds heavy and healthy than a couple of pounds lighter and then skirting on the risk of injury or illness. Yeah,
and especially on the elite side, we hear quite a lot about these elite athletes that maybe struggle for a couple of years or something until they realize that they put on 5 pounds and then suddenly they start to perform that much better in training again, like they haven't done for years. And of course, what follows is they start performing in races. So they have spent a lot of energy trying to be as light as possible, but have been shortchanging their performance without even realizing it until, for some reason, they changed something and then things start to fall into place.
Yeah, and a lot of these athletes, I mean, they think they're doing something healthy in terms of dealing with their diet. I recently dealt with an old friend who, has been just not even an elite athlete. Just she exercises a lot. She's a runner. And then, after years and years of this, found out that she had very bad bone mineral density. And she's in her early 40s, and that's not a great place to be starting out the second half of your life. So yeah, I mean, I think always health has to come first.
Yeah.
The fact is that almost none of us are in a position that we are going to go out there and win an Olympic medal, or are going to have some huge endorsement deal where we're going to make millions of dollars. The fact is, most of us do sport because we enjoy sport, and that needs to be the focus. It needs to be the focus of doing something that you love in a healthy way. That chasing the last 1% of performance is almost never worth the potential risk of doing that. For a person who's not a professional, who's not at the very pointy end of the field.
Yeah, and especially when we don't know if that final percentage is even there in the first place.
Exactly.
So, are there some other common myths or misconceptions in endurance sports that you would like to take the opportunity to bust or discuss?
Yeah, I mean, really, there's so many of them. I mean, for me, one of the most important things I talk to people about is supplements. Ron Maughan, who's really one of the preeminent physiologists of his generation, has a really good line, which is that if it works, it's probably illegal, and if it's legal, it probably doesn't work. And that's very true. We know there's a very limited number of things that benefit athletic performance. We know that high carbohydrates work. We know that to an extent dietary nitrate works. We know caffeine works. And there's not much beyond that that's legal or safe. And so people who are endlessly taking vitamins, who are endlessly taking these different types of supplements, we know that they don't work. They've been tested and shown not to work. And a lot of times when things do work, it's because they're contaminated with something else. Over the years, I've seen many high school athletes who get referred to me by a primary care physician with funny liver function tests. And that's one of the signs someone might be on oral steroids, for example. And so I started asking them, "Are you taking steroids? Are you using anabolic agents?" No. They swear up and down that they're, that they're not doing anything illegal. They're not doing anything crazy. And in several cases, I've had their supplements tested, and I found them contaminated with anabolic agents. Very often, a lot of these things come from factories in China or the third world someplace, and they're contaminated with things. And the reason why they work is because they're contaminated with something illegal.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's not a situation that we want to get into, but there have been several age group cases as well where people have been busted for doping in recent years for, in many cases, supplements that were contaminated. So they weren't knowingly taking any illegal drugs, but yeah, that's definitely.
Again, that's really a sad situation. And what you need to be thinking about is what are the potential results to the rest of your life? If I, as a physician, turned up positive for some kind of ridiculous, performance-enhancing drug, what does that do to my job? What does that do to my reputation? Or if you're an attorney or you work for the post office or whatever, these things could have serious effects on the rest of your life.
Yeah. Yeah. What about other myths or misconceptions? Anything else than supplements?
The other big one is, of course, diet, which we've already discussed a little bit. This idea that we're going to do a ketogenic diet and it's going to make me burn fat better and perform better.
Can I just ask one follow-up on that? In terms of, because some people say that it's more of a health or a lifestyle choice, but what's your view on the evidence in terms of if we disregard endurance performance completely and just view it from a normal general population, general health perspective? What do we? Does that change anything?
Yeah, just when you're thinking about just health, when you look at weight loss, for example, and you compare things from everything from and Mike Joyner from Mayo loves to tweet about this. When you look at everything from Weight Watchers to low carb to whatever, what you find is that diets work because they're calorie limited, and it doesn't matter what it is. It is going to result in a similar weight loss and a durable weight loss, provided you stick to the diet. There is no magic diet. We do have good evidence that the diets that are very high in saturated fat are not good for you. That they do help accelerate heart disease and cardiovascular disease. And that doesn't magically change because it's the flavor of the month. And so, the example I always like to use is that open your mouth and look in the mirror. You have got the teeth of an omnivore. You have got, molars that grind up grains and things like that. You've got incisors to cut meat. So evolution is telling you something, right? Like many primates, you are meant to eat everything. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we suddenly think that we're going to outsmart millions of years of evolution and say, oh, if all I do is eat just meat and cheese, that's going to make me healthy. It's just not the case. eat a balanced diet, not too much, eat enough green things, and you're going to be, and do some exercise, and you're going to be okay. I just don't think there's a lot of hay to be made through any of these magical diets.
Yeah, I 100% agree. So go on then. What were the other things, myths or misconceptions that you had in mind?
Yeah, the other major myth is that people think that they can execute the training program of some great athlete and that they will also be great. And I can't tell you how often my inbox has been full of people. Well, so-and-so is doing this. I read on this website that this is their key workout for the week. And so, a great example of this is when we were working on Breaking 2, Eliud Kipchoge published some of his workouts. And immediately I had athletes talk to me about trying to execute these workouts. I mean, his first workout of the year, when I showed up in Kenya at his track, he was doing 12 or 16 by 1200 meters at about 4:30 per mile pace. Now, that is going to kill the average athlete, and that's a really ridiculous example. But the point is that great athletes are genetically superior to the rest of us. They have certain innate gifts that make them great at what they do. Even if Eliud had never ran, he would still run faster than 99.99% of people on the planet because it's the way he's built. And so the important thing is for athletes to understand that there is no magic, there is no easy way, there is no secret. The secret is there is no secret. You need to find what works for you and execute that, and not be swayed by whatever you read on the internet this week or whatever you think some great athlete is doing.
Perfect. Anything else in that area? Myths or misconceptions?
No, that's
a good list. What about in addition to tracking performance
I apologize. I'm getting paged here. I'm going to need to run away to see.
Okay. So thank you so much for your time, then, Phil. And it was really great to have you on. And it was an excellent discussion, and I think that the listeners will get a lot of value from it.
Good. Yeah. And if you ever want to catch up on some more things at another time, we can certainly do that. I apologize for having to abandon ship.
Okay. No problem. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Sure. Take care. Bye.
All right, so that was a bit of an abrupt end to the interview, but we got most of the way there. I had just a few questions left on my list. I wanted to talk a little bit about what investments that might be the best for age group athletes, and comparing, for example, lab tests and assessments, coaching and guidance, and with purchasing gadgets and equipment. Also, I wanted to talk a little bit about whether there are any specific training metrics or key performance indicators that Dr. Skiba thinks are particularly important. And those were the main things, a couple of small things other than that. But we didn't miss that much. And I hope that we can have Dr. Skiba on again, because I really enjoyed the conversation. And it is clear why he is so sought after and in this industry, and working on some pretty high level projects, including the Breaking 2, of course. So some of my key takeaways, I noted down some things that really stood out to me here. First, finding what works for you as an individual is super important. We talked, among other things, about there being people that respond well or not so well to high volume versus high intensity, and the other way around. And that's the thing that you and your coach really need to figure out for you as an athlete, and not on the basis of another athlete, but really for you. And on that note, we also discussed there that 99% of coaching is communication, or something along those lines, 95. I don't remember what Dr. Skiba said, but regardless, it's super important. And that's something that we've talked about many times before. Me and my coaching partner, James, we take this super seriously, and we have communication as our North Star in the coaching that we do here at Scientific Triathlon. But please note that as an athlete, you have just as much a responsibility to contribute to that as the coach, because if you're not communicating to your coach, it's difficult for the coach to be effective with their communication with you, and it can't be a one-way street. It's a two-way street. So keep that in mind, that communication is is super important. And to give you just a practical example, I'd rather that you give me your report of how your workout went and don't upload the workout data than just get the data and not the report. The next takeaway that I have is that as a good general starting point for how to incorporate intensity in the average triathlon training program, Phil mentioned having one session of shorter intervals per week per discipline. So these would be intervals of, let's say, 1.5 to 4 minutes in duration. And then 1 second session per week per discipline of longer intervals. So those would be 5 to 20 minutes. And the final takeaway here, and we're probably going to get hate mail for this, but it's that diet thing again. But really, keep things healthy but simple. Don't be restrictive in terms of total calories or in terms of macronutrients. Definitely don't fall for fads, neither diets nor supplements. You can find the show notes for this episode as usual on thattriathlonshow.com and leave your comments or questions for the episode in that comment section down at the bottom of the page. I have a few house cleaning items before we go. First, I want to really thank you so much for all the reviews, ratings and reviews that you guys sent in for the podcast in February. It was by far a record month for new reviews, so he was absolutely fantastic, and I read every single one of them from all the iTunes stores because I get an aggregator email that at the end of the month that brings them all to me, and so really I'm super grateful to all of you that rated and reviewed the podcast. I'll read a short one, and this one says the best 5 stars, and it's from 1364 Ron in the United States. And Ron writes, thank you for providing one of the 2 podcasts that I get excited about when a new episode comes out. Amazing, that's all I can say. Thank you again for what you do. So thank you so much for that, Ron, but man, what a cliffhanger. Please email me and let me know what that other podcast is, because just in case it's something that I'm not already listening to and am subscribed to, I will absolutely have to check it out because I'm a podcast junkie myself and consume a lot of podcasts. The second house cleaning item that I have is that I'm looking to bring on somebody to the Scientific Triathlon team for a part-time role as a customer support role, I guess. And the person should be highly motivated, highly service-minded, and an excellent communicator, both verbally and in writing. And also, they need to be fairly knowledgeable in triathlon and have a can-do attitude. And it needs to be somebody that can figure things out without too much hand-holding. It's a remote job and it's a flexible job, so you can do it from anywhere in the world and at flexible hours. But and I'm not sure exactly how much, but probably we're talking about a starting point of 1 to 2 hours per day on weekdays. But those hours you can do whenever you want. So it's fairly flexible and still fairly open, so we can discuss the specifics of it. But if you're interested or you know somebody interested, send me an email to michael@scientifictriathlon.com, and that's Michael with a K, and we can take it from there. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Roka, that you can find on roka.com, and you can get 20% off your entire order with the new promo code TTS, nothing else, TTS. And thank you to Precision Hydration. You can find them on precisionhydration.com. You can take the free online sweat test to get your individual hydration strategy and get your first box of electrolytes for free with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.